Empire of Liberty, A History of the Early United States Republic, 1789 to 1815. Written by Harry Montgomery, narrated by Cedar Reyes. Chapter 1, Foundations of the New Republic. In 1789, the United States stood at a turning point. After years of conflict during the American Revolution and an uncertain post-war period under the Articles of Confederation, the country was in need of stronger national leadership. The new Constitution, ratified in 1788, was designed to create a more effective federal system while still preserving the ideals of liberty and republicanism. This document was a compromise between those who wanted a powerful central government and those who feared tyranny. It created 3 branches of government: executive, legislative, and judicial, each with checks and balances to prevent abuse of power. The Bill of Rights, added shortly after ratification, helped ease concerns by protecting individual freedoms such as speech, religion, and the right to a fair trial. With the Constitution in place, attention turned to the task of putting it into practice. George Washington was unanimously elected as the first president, taking office in April 1789. His presence offered reassurance to many citizens who trusted his leadership and commitment to Republican values. Washington worked to establish the authority of the executive branch without appearing monarchical. He formed the first presidential cabinet, appointing Thomas Jefferson as Secretary of State, Alexander Hamilton as Secretary of the Treasury, and Henry Knox as Secretary of War. This team would help shape the future direction of the Republic. The first Congress, meanwhile, worked to set up the basic structures of the new government. They created the federal court system through the Judiciary Act of 1789 and established executive departments. They also passed revenue legislation to fund the government's activities. One of the early and pressing tasks was addressing the national debt from the Revolution. Alexander Hamilton proposed a financial plan that included federal assumption of state debts, the creation of a national bank, and new taxes. His ideas met resistance, especially from Jefferson and others who feared centralization of financial power, but they were mostly enacted and laid the foundation for American capitalism. Foreign relations were also a concern during this early period. The French Revolution began shortly after Washington's inauguration, and Americans were divided in their reactions. Some saw it as a continuation of the fight for liberty. Others feared its violence and radicalism. Washington declared neutrality, believing the young nation was too fragile for European entanglements. This decision angered some but helped preserve peace during a critical stage of development. The early years of the Republic were filled with both promise and tension. The government was still new, political factions were beginning to form, and many Americans were unsure how the new system would work in practice. Despite this uncertainty, the foundations of the United States were solidifying. The Constitution provided a structure, Washington's leadership offered stability, and early institutions began to grow. These foundational years set the tone for the Republic's future, balancing order and liberty in an ongoing experiment of democratic governance. The legacy of the American Revolution. The American Revolution left an enduring impact on the emerging United States and had significant repercussions for political thought and practice, both within the new nation and abroad. After years of colonial rebellion against British authority, the Revolution was not just a military and political victory, but also a powerful statement about the rights and aspirations of individuals. This transformative period redefined the relationship between the governed and the government, replacing monarchical rule with a system based on democratic ideals and the principle of consent of the governed. In the wake of victory, the revolutionary movement inspired a fervor of ideological debate as Americans sought to put into practice the rights and liberties for which they had fought. The revolution was rooted in Enlightenment ideas that emphasized natural rights, equality under the law, and the importance of civic virtue. These principles were integrated into a system that was intended to provide protection for individual freedoms and to ensure that political power was derived from the people rather than a distant sovereign. The adoption of foundational documents, culminating in both the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, cemented these ideas into the legal and cultural fabric of the nation. The practical outcomes of the revolution were as profound as its ideological contributions. Social hierarchies began to shift as the old distinctions between aristocracy and common folk were called into question. While these changes were neither immediate nor universal, the rhetoric of the revolution paved the way for gradual reforms in education, property rights, and political participation. The values of equality and liberty sowed seeds of change that would later blossom into movements for the abolition of slavery and the advancement of civil rights. Despite persistent inequalities and contradictions, the revolution established a framework for a society where upward mobility and self-improvement became attainable goals for many citizens. Internationally, the American Revolution resonated as a challenge to established power structures. The success of the colonists demonstrated that organized resistance, underpinned by a well-articulated ideology of individual rights and representative government, could upend traditional systems of governance. European powers, particularly those bound by feudal or monarchical traditions, took notice of the revolution's radical implications. Over time, the ideas born in America would help fuel other movements for independence and democratic reform. Revolutionary leaders became symbols of resistance and liberty, and the American example served as a beacon for oppressed peoples seeking self-determination. Domestically, the legacy of the American Revolution set the stage for the evolving nature of American government. The establishment of a republic based on Republican ideals proved to be a difficult experiment, fraught with the challenge of balancing differing visions of government. These tensions would later manifest in the formation of political parties and debates over the extent of federal power. Nevertheless, the revolution's fundamental commitment to certain unalienable rights laid a foundation of political culture defined by civic responsibility, skepticism of concentrated power, and a vigorous engagement with public affairs. Ultimately, the American Revolution was more than a political transition. It was an ideological revolution that reshaped the identity of a nation and charted a course for future generations. Its legacy endures in the values and institutions that continue to characterize the United States and the modern democracies around the world. Drafting and ratifying the Constitution. In the wake of the American Revolution, the newly independent states faced the monumental task of designing a government that could effectively unite the diverse interests of their people while preventing the tyranny they had fought so hard to overthrow. The process of drafting the Constitution was an unprecedented experiment in political innovation, undertaken by a group of enlightened thinkers and experienced statesmen who were determined to create a framework capable of guiding the nation into a stable future. Meetings held at the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia brought together delegates from various states, each with distinct political traditions and concerns, to engage in intense debates and negotiations that would eventually give birth to the nation's supreme legal document. The challenges in drafting the Constitution were formidable, stemming largely from the need to balance competing interests and regional differences. Delegates grappled with issues such as representation, the division of power between the federal government and the states, and the extent to which the government should exert control over commerce and taxation. Compromises were necessary to reconcile the demands of both large and small states, leading to the creation of a bicameral legislature. The House of Representatives was designed to reflect population size, while the Senate was constructed on the principle of equal representation for each state. These arrangements sought to ensure that the voices of both populous and less populous regions would be adequately heard in the new government. The drafting process was marked by passionate debates, vigorous discussions, and at times, bitter disagreements. Delegates such as James Madison emerged as influential figures, advocating for a system of checks and balances to prevent any one branch of government from becoming too powerful. Their ideas were deeply influenced by Enlightenment principles and prior models of government, yet the final document bore a uniquely American imprint that reflected the practical experiences of colonial self-governance and the recent struggle for independence. The resulting Constitution embodied a spirit of compromise, balancing the need for a strong central government with the preservation of individual state rights and liberties. After the draft was completed, the focus shifted to ratification, a process that proved nearly as contentious as the drafting stage. The proposed Constitution required approval from the states, but the nation was deeply divided on the merits of a strong federal government. The debates over ratification ignited public discourse across the newly formed republic, as supporters of the Constitution, known as Federalists, argued that the document would foster unity and promote prosperity, while opponents, later known as Anti-Federalists, feared that the concentration of power could undermine the freedoms for which they had fought. Pamphlets, newspaper editorials, and public meetings became the battlegrounds for these ideological contests. Ultimately, a series of compromises helped secure the Constitution's ratification, most notably the promise to add a Bill of Rights that would enumerate and protect individual liberties. This assurance was critical in persuading skeptical citizens and state leaders that the new government would be restrained by law and accountable to the people. The successful ratification of the Constitution marked a turning point in American history, as it provided a durable foundation for the Republic and set forth principles that would continue to guide the nation through the complexities of governance and the evolution of democratic ideals. The first federal government. After the ratification of the Constitution, the United States entered an era of unprecedented experimentation in governance with the establishment of its first federal government. This early government was tasked with translating the ideals embedded in the Constitution into practical policies capable of uniting a disparate collection of states under one national framework. As the new federal system took shape, its leaders faced the daunting challenge of balancing power between the federal government and the states, all while addressing a host of issues inherited from the Revolutionary era. The inaugural administration, led by President George Washington, set the tone for the new government's operations. Washington's leadership was instrumental in providing a sense of stability during a period of substantial uncertainty. Recognizing the symbolic importance of his position, Washington sought to establish precedents for future administrations by adhering strictly to the principles of neutrality and restraint. His choice in appointing key figures for his cabinet, including figures such as Alexander Hamilton, Thomas Jefferson, and Henry Knox, reinforced the necessity of having capable advisors who would help navigate the intricacies of governance. The careful selection of cabinet members underlined the new government's commitment to expert administration and laid the groundwork for how executive power would function in balance with the legislative and judicial branches. Within the early federal government, the challenges were multifaceted. One of the primary issues was establishing the legitimacy of the federal authority in the eyes of the public and the individual states. The government had to prove that it was capable of managing national affairs without encroaching on states' rights. This task involved not only creating institutions, such as the federal judiciary and an organized army, but also implementing fiscal policies that would stabilize the nation's finances. Alexander Hamilton's financial plan, which included the federal assumption of state debts and the creation of a national bank, was a cornerstone of these efforts. The plan sought to secure the credit of the United States, ensure a steady source of revenue, and foster economic growth, despite provoking controversy among advocates of strict state sovereignty. Legislatively, the first federal government set about crafting policies that addressed both immediate post-war necessities and long-term structural reforms. The first Congress was instrumental in enacting laws that would support national defense, establish trade regulations, and create a rudimentary framework for commerce. The legislative branch, working closely with the executive, established foundational precedents for federal law and set the stage for a functioning national government. These early legislative acts were often met with vigorous debate, reflecting the deep-seated divisions between those who favored a robust federal presence and those wary of centralized power. The early federal government also focused on legitimizing its authority on the international stage by maintaining neutrality in the face of European conflicts, while establishing diplomatic channels that would later secure beneficial trade agreements. Although the nation was young and still grappling with internal divisions, the government's actions during this period demonstrated an early commitment to stability, order, and the practical application of its revolutionary ideals. Despite challenges and occasional setbacks, the first federal government succeeded in laying down the institutional foundations that would sustain and evolve into the modern American state. Chapter 2: Washington's Presidency and the Shape of the Nation. George Washington's presidency marked a defining era in the early United States as the country began to shape its national identity and clarify the roles of its central institutions. His leadership was crucial in establishing political practices and setting precedents that would guide not only the executive branch, but also the entire framework of the federal government. Serving as the nation's first president, Washington was aware that every action he took would be closely scrutinized, so he strove to embody the ideals of Republican virtue, integrity, and impartiality. His careful navigation of the political landscape helped solidify the young nation's course toward a stable and respected governmental structure. During his time in office, Washington focused on creating a balance between strong leadership and a nonpartisan government. He believed that the new republic needed a president who respected the separation of powers as outlined by the Constitution and who was sensitive to the concerns of both state and federal interests. This balance was reflected in his appointment of a diverse cabinet, which included figures with contrasting views such as Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson. Their varied perspectives ensured that policies considered by the administration took into account a broad range of opinions and regional interests. Washington's ability to steer between conflicting viewpoints without alienating key factions of the political landscape proved essential in establishing the legitimacy of the new federal system. Washington's presidency was characterized by his deliberate approach to executive power. He consciously avoided actions that might be interpreted as monarchical, setting a tone of moderation and adherence to the rule of law. His voluntary stepping down after 2 terms was particularly influential, as it set a precedent for the peaceful transition of power and established the principle that no individual should hold the presidency for life. This decision fostered a culture in which leadership was temporary and subject to the will of the people, reinforcing the importance of democratic governance in the new republic. On the international front, Washington maintained a policy of neutrality that sought to keep the fledgling nation out of the ever-present conflicts in Europe. Understanding the vulnerabilities of a young country, he issued proclamations that advocated for a strictly independent foreign policy and avoided entanglement in alliances that could drag the United States into war. By placing national interests above partisan or ideological alliances, Washington ensured that the country could focus on its internal development and fortification. His pragmatic approach to diplomacy earned the respect of other nations and laid the groundwork for future American foreign policy, which would balance moral principles with national security interests. Economic development was another critical area under Washington's watch. Recognizing that fiscal stability was essential for the nation's future, his administration supported policies designed to encourage commerce and industry while establishing credit for the federal government. Initiatives such as negotiating trade agreements and formulating principles for taxation helped stabilize the national economy, laying the financial foundations that later proved pivotal during periods of expansion and conflict. Throughout his presidency, Washington demonstrated a pragmatic commitment to building a nation that balanced strong central authority with respect for the diverse aspirations of its citizens, setting the stage for an enduring experiment in democratic governance. Establishing executive authority. From the earliest days of the Republic, the need to firmly establish executive authority was a priority for the new nation, and the process involved both practical administrative efforts and the careful crafting of constitutional principles. The executive branch had to demonstrate that it could govern effectively without overshadowing the other branches, while also providing the leadership necessary to guide the country during a time of significant change and uncertainty. Early on, the challenge was to create a model of executive power that was robust enough to enforce the law and coordinate national affairs, yet restrained by a system of checks and balances to prevent tyranny. Central to this process was the leadership of George Washington, whose presidency became the testing ground for the ideas embedded in the Constitution. Washington was acutely aware that the legitimacy of the executive office depended on public confidence and the willingness of the people to accept a centralized authority that could act decisively in times of crisis. He worked hard to separate the role of the president from that of a monarch, deliberately avoiding the trappings of autocracy and insisting on a rigorous adherence to constitutional principles. Through his careful tone and measured actions, Washington set an early standard that emphasized the importance of rule of law and accountability over personal power. Establishing executive authority also involved laying the groundwork for the administrative structures that would support effective governance. The creation of an organized cabinet was critical, as it provided the president with expert advice and helped to distribute the responsibilities of the federal government among dedicated officials. Men such as Alexander Hamilton, Thomas Jefferson, and Henry Knox each played key roles in defining the scope and limits of the executive branch. Their diverse viewpoints contributed to a broader understanding of what it meant to govern a republic and underscored the importance of collaboration between the branches of government. In shaping the role of the president, these early officials demonstrated that executive power was not synonymous with unchecked authority, but rather a tool for securing the nation's interests and ensuring a balanced system of government. Another element in establishing executive authority was the formulation and implementation of policies aimed at unifying a nation fragmented by differing regional interests and political loyalties. The president's role extended to guiding both domestic and foreign policy, and careful stewardship was necessary to manage the dual challenges of internal dissent and external threats. Washington's insistence on neutrality in foreign affairs, for instance, was a reflection of the executive branch's ability to act in the nation's best interest without resorting to aggressive expansion of power. By focusing on measured responses and clear communication, Washington provided a model for how a strong yet modest executive could help stabilize the new republic, reassuring citizens and other nations alike of the government's commitment to democratic ideals. The evolution of executive authority during these formative years was not without its challenges. Political opposition and competing interpretations of the Constitution frequently brought questions about the limits of presidential power to the forefront of national debate. However, through a combination of principled leadership, institutional innovation, and a steadfast commitment to the ideals of Republican government, early American leaders managed to carve out an executive role that was both effective and restrained. This delicate balance laid the foundation for a presidency that would continue to evolve, reflecting the enduring values of the nation and serving as a bulwark against both internal disorder and external threats. Hamilton's financial vision. Alexander Hamilton's financial vision transformed the economic landscape of the fledgling United States and set the stage for a modern industrialized economy. As the nation struggled with debt from the Revolutionary War, Hamilton proposed bold measures that redefined the relationship between the federal government and the country's finances. His comprehensive plan sought to consolidate state and federal debts, establish a solid credit system, and encourage domestic industry, thereby unifying disparate economic interests under a strong national framework. Hamilton believed that the survival of the new republic depended on creating stability and confidence in its financial institutions. By assuming the war debts incurred by the states during the Revolution, he aimed to bond the states together through a shared fiscal obligation to the federal government. This move, though controversial, was designed to both equalize the financial responsibilities of the states and establish a reputation for creditworthiness that could attract foreign investment. A nation that could reliably meet its obligations, Hamilton argued, would not only inspire confidence among its citizens, but also command respect from international markets. At the core of Hamilton's approach was the creation of a national bank, intended as an instrument to manage the country's finances and regulate the money supply. The bank would serve as a depository for federal funds, facilitate payments, and provide loans that would spur economic growth. Hamilton viewed the bank as a critical intermediary that could channel capital into productive ventures, while also offering stability in a period when chaotic state banknotes and depreciating currencies threatened the economic unity of the United States. Though the proposal for a national bank encountered significant opposition from those wary of centralized power, Hamilton's determination to secure financial order prevailed as the concept gradually found acceptance. Hamilton also focused on modernizing the nation's economic infrastructure through his emphasis on tariffs and industrial policy. He advocated for protective tariffs as a means to nurture emerging American industries that could compete with established European powers. Hamilton understood that by shielding domestic manufacturers from the full force of foreign competition, the nation could eventually attain self-sufficiency and robust economic independence. Furthermore, by funneling revenue generated through tariffs into federal coffers, the government would have the means to invest in critical infrastructure projects and education, laying the groundwork for long-term economic development. Critics of Hamilton's financial vision argued that his approach favored the wealthy and might lead to excessive government intervention in the economy. However, Hamilton countered that a strong central financial system was essential for ensuring national stability, and that investment in industry would ultimately benefit all citizens by creating jobs and increasing prosperity. His proposals fundamentally reshaped the role of government in economic affairs, shifting from a limited framework defined by the experiences of colonial self-governance to a more proactive, centralized system capable of steering the nation through the challenges of modernity. Ultimately, Hamilton's financial vision established enduring principles that remain central to American fiscal policy. By addressing the nation's debt, creating institutions to manage financial flows, and promoting a strategic balance between free enterprise and government oversight, Hamilton laid the foundation for an economic system that has evolved to meet the needs of an ever-changing world. His legacy persists as a testament to the transformative power of innovative, forward-thinking economic policy. Foreign affairs and neutrality. The young American Republic faced immense challenges from the very beginning in the realm of international relations, where the fractious European landscape threatened to pull the fledgling nation into conflicts far removed from its own borders. In response to these external pressures, The leaders of the early United States embraced a strategy of neutrality, understanding that in order to preserve its stability and allow for internal development, the country had to steer a careful course between the competing powers of Europe. From the onset, American policymakers were aware that the nation was still too fragile to become entangled in the ideological and military struggles that had long dominated European politics. Key figures in the government argued that neutrality was not a sign of weakness, but rather a strategic necessity that would safeguard the nation's long-term interests. By refusing to align too closely with any of the European powers, the United States could focus on consolidating its governmental institutions, building a robust economy, and establishing a national identity free from the influence of age-old rivalries. The adoption of neutrality was not an easy decision. The United States was born in revolution, its independence a direct challenge to the monarchical systems that prevailed in Europe. This historical context provided a strong ideological impetus toward supporting liberal movements abroad. However, the practical realities of statecraft soon dictated otherwise. The government recognized that the country's military and economic weaknesses made it vulnerable, and that the costs of becoming involved in European wars could be catastrophic. In this light, neutrality emerged as a prudent policy designed to shield the nation from conflicts that might otherwise divert critical resources and jeopardize the newfound independence. The administration under President Washington formalized this stance with a series of diplomatic measures intended to make clear the country's commitment to remaining neutral. By issuing formal proclamations and carefully negotiating trade and diplomatic arrangements, the United States sent a clear message that it sought peaceful engagement rather than confrontation. This approach was meant to balance the moral impulse to support liberty with the practical need to avoid the spiraling costs of warfare. Washington's insistence on neutrality also aimed at preserving the integrity of the American experiment in democracy, ensuring that internal developments were not undermined by external conflicts. Neutrality also proved to be a diplomatic tool that allowed the United States to develop its economic and political institutions unimpeded by military commitments. It afforded American diplomats the ability to engage with various nations, building relationships that would later prove instrumental in establishing trade agreements and setting the stage for future alliances. By remaining non-aligned, the United States could benefit from opportunities to import ideas, technology, and capital, all of which contributed to its domestic growth. Moreover, this policy of detachment established a pattern that would influence American foreign policy for decades to come, emphasizing American autonomy and a measured approach to international engagement. In choosing neutrality over entanglement, the early American government made a deliberate decision to focus inward, fostering stability and growth at home while cautiously observing the turbulent dynamics abroad. This foundational strategy allowed the United States to emerge from its nascent stages with a clear sense of purpose, balancing ideals with pragmatism as it navigated the complex arena of international affairs. Chapter 3: Political Conflict and the Rise of Parties. The early years of the United States were marked by growing political conflict that eventually gave rise to formal political parties. The ideological battles that erupted during this period centered around fundamental questions about the nature of the new government's authority and the interpretation of the Constitution. While the framers envisioned a government that would operate on principles of compromise and balance, conflicting visions soon emerged regarding issues such as federal power, economic policy, and foreign relations. As the Republic began to function, leaders within the government started to align themselves with different interpretations of the nation's founding documents. One faction favored a strong central government capable of unifying the diverse states a position championed by figures like Alexander Hamilton. His vision emphasized the need for a robust federal authority to regulate commerce, manage national debt, and promote economic development through various fiscal policies. In contrast, other influential figures believed that concentrating too much power in the federal government could lead to tyranny. Prominent among these were Thomas Jefferson and his supporters, who advocated for a more decentralized, agrarian model. They argued that power should remain closer to the people through state governments, preserving the values of local autonomy and individual liberties. This clash of ideas created a fertile ground for political conflict. Disagreements were not confined solely to elite circles, but extended into public debates through newspapers, pamphlets, and town hall meetings. The emerging political struggle became both a reflection of deep-seated ideological differences and a contest for control over how the nation would grow and prosper. The debates were passionate and persistent, characterized by accusations of elitism on one side and charges of disloyalty on the other. Critics of Hamilton's policies contended that his initiatives favored the wealthy and urban interests, while Jeffersonians maintained that a government centered on commerce and finance was incompatible with democratic principles. The political conflicts eventually solidified into organized parties as the divisions among influential leaders became more pronounced. The Federalists, led by Hamilton, supported the idea of a strong national government, an economically diversified society, and a vigorous role in international affairs. On the other side, the Democratic Republicans, under Jefferson's leadership, advocated for a return to simpler values, emphasizing the agrarian tradition, states' rights, and a limited federal government. This alignment of interests created a polarized political landscape where policy debates were framed by these emerging affiliations. Consequently, elections became battlegrounds for ideological disputes, with each party mobilizing voters by articulating clear, contrasting visions for the future of the republic. The rise of political parties had profound implications for how the country was governed. The party system introduced a new dynamic into the political process, one that would increasingly shape debates on legislation, foreign policy, and domestic reform. It also laid the groundwork for the evolution of political identities that continue to influence American politics today. The intense political rivalry of the period was both a source of innovation and a challenge, as it pushed leaders to clarify their positions and engage more deeply with the electorate. In a sense, the emergence of parties helped to institutionalize political conflict, providing channels through which differences could be managed, contested, and occasionally reconciled. The Federalists and the Republicans. The political landscape in early America was defined by the emergence of two powerful factions that held contrasting visions for the new nation: the Federalists and the Republicans, also known as the Democratic Republicans, developed in response to differing interpretations of the Constitution and conflicting ideas about the appropriate balance of power in government. At the heart of this divide were questions concerning the structure of the federal system, the role of the central government, and the direction of the country's economic and foreign policies. The Federalists, led by figures such as Alexander Hamilton and John Adams, championed a robust national government that could effectively manage the complexities of a growing, diverse nation. They believed that a strong central government was essential for maintaining order, regulating commerce, and ensuring national security. Hamilton's financial policies, for instance, were designed to create a stable economic foundation through the assumption of state debts, the establishment of a national bank, and the promotion of industry. Federalists argued that these measures were critical for fostering economic prosperity and establishing the credibility of the United States on the international stage. Their vision was influenced by a pragmatic approach to governance that emphasized the necessity of central authority in mitigating the weaknesses inherent in a loose confederation of states. In contrast, the Republican faction, spearheaded by Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, argued for a far more decentralized system of government. They believed that the strength of the new republic lay in preserving individual liberties and maintaining the autonomy of the states. Republicans were wary of concentrated power and insisted that the federal government should have only those enumerated powers explicitly granted to it by the Constitution. For them, the specter of tyranny, whether from an overly powerful legislature or executive, was a constant concern, and they advocated for a strict construction of the Constitution. This ideological stance resonated with many Americans who valued agrarianism, local self-government, and a form of democracy that placed a premium on individual freedoms over centralized control. The debates between these two factions were not merely abstract legal arguments, but had far-reaching practical consequences. Federalists tended to draw support from urban centers, commercial interests, and those who believed that industry and trade were the engines of national growth. Meanwhile, Republicans found their base among rural populations and the agrarian sector, reflecting regional interests that prioritized local control and limited government intervention. These divisions were reflected in contentious political campaigns, legislative struggles, and the evolving nature of electoral politics, as both sides mobilized supporters and framed the future of the country in starkly different terms. Despite their profound differences, both the Federalist and Republican models played critical roles in shaping early American political thought. The Federalists laid the groundwork for a modern administrative state with strong institutions, while Republicans underscored the importance of preserving individual liberty and state sovereignty. The rivalry between these two factions drove essential political debates that helped define the boundaries of federal power and underscored the dynamic nature of American democracy. Over time, the tensions between centralized authority and states' rights would continue to influence policy decisions and the evolution of the nation's government, leaving a legacy that still resonates in American political discourse today. The election of 1796. The election of 1796 marked one of the first major national contests in the history of the United States and underscored the growing influence of partisan differences that were beginning to shape American politics. This contest brought to the forefront important issues regarding national leadership, political ideology, and the balance of power in the new republic. The campaign was fiercely contested between the Federalist candidate John Adams and the Democratic-Republican candidate Thomas Jefferson. It revealed deep regional, economic, and ideological divisions that would continue to influence the country's political landscape for decades to come. Adams, representing the Federalist vision of a strong central government and an active engagement with European powers, sought to secure stability and maintain the legacy of the Revolutionary Order. His supporters valued his commitment to order and his experience as a statesman and diplomat. On the other hand, Jefferson's campaign capitalized on the ideal of a more decentralized government that would safeguard the rights of individual states and promote a vision of liberty that resonated with many agrarian communities. The contest was not only a choice between two political figures, but also a clash of fundamentally different ideas about how the nation should be governed. The mechanics of the election itself were reflective of the constitutional provisions of the time, which allowed each elector to cast two votes without distinguishing between a vote for president or vice president. This system, however, led to complications, especially as it became evident that the political alignment of the electors would shape the outcome in unpredictable ways. In 1796, the geographic and political affiliations of the electors became a crucial factor since voters in different regions were deeply divided along partisan lines. Northeastern states tended to favor the Federalist perspective, while Southern and Western states showed more affinity for the Republican ideals championed by Jefferson. As votes were counted and political maneuvering unfolded, the election exposed the weaknesses in the existing electoral process. The candidate's inability to clearly signal how electors should vote for a president or vice president contributed to the ambiguity that emerged in the results. The outcome of the election resulted in a victory for Adams, while Jefferson emerged as the runner-up, thereby setting the stage for an uneasy balance of power in a political system where the president and the vice president could come from opposing parties. This incongruity underscored the complexities of a new experiment in democratic governance and revealed that the mechanisms for electing national leaders were still in a nascent stage. The election of 1796 contributed to the evolution of American political culture by sharpening partisan divides and demonstrating the challenges inherent in forming a coherent national executive. It highlighted the emerging reality that political competition was not merely a contest of personalities, but a battle of ideas regarding the future direction of the nation. Though the process was marred by its imperfections and laid bare the need for institutional improvements, the election of 1796 ultimately played a critical role in shaping the trajectory of American politics by forcing the new republic to contend with issues of representation, partisanship, and the proper balance of power within the federal government. The Alien and Sedition Acts. The Alien and Sedition Acts, enacted in 1798 during a period of intense political polarization and international tension, became some of the most controversial pieces of legislation in early American history. These acts were introduced by the Federalist-controlled Congress and signed into law by President John Adams, reflecting the heightened anxieties of the time and a desire to secure the nation against internal threats and foreign influences. The laws were ostensibly designed to address the dangers of espionage and subversion during a period when the United States was on edge due to the ongoing conflict between France and Britain. Yet they quickly came to be seen as powerful tools that the Federalist government used to suppress dissent and curb political opposition. At the heart of the legislation was a series of measures that expanded the government's authority over immigrants and provided for the detention and deportation of non-citizens deemed dangerous. The acts allowed the president to exercise extraordinary power by declaring a state of national emergency, under which certain aliens could be detained or expelled without the protections typically granted to legal residents. This aspect of the laws underscored the anxieties about foreign influence and the suspicion that immigrants could act as agents of hostile powers or otherwise undermine national security in a turbulent global context. The Sedition Act, perhaps the most widely criticized component, went further than the other measures by targeting speech. It criminalized the publication of false, scandalous, and malicious statements against the federal government or its officials. This law struck at the core of democratic principles by restricting freedom of expression and the vital role of the press in holding government accountable. Critics argued that the Sedition Act was an infringement on the First Amendment, undermining the ability of citizens to engage in robust political debate and to criticize their leaders without fear of legal retribution. The act was used to silence dissent and target journalists and political opponents, significantly stifling public debate during one of the nation's formative periods. Political fallout from the Alien and Sedition Acts was significant and far-reaching. The opposition, largely embodied by the Democratic Republicans led by Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, viewed the acts as emblematic of Federalist overreach and a betrayal of the revolutionary principles of liberty and free speech. They argued that these measures not only endangered individual rights, but also threatened the democratic foundations of the Republic by centralizing power in the hands of a few. The backlash against the acts contributed to a series of political developments, including the formation of organized resistance, which ultimately helped to galvanize public opinion and shift the political landscape. Although intended to protect the nation during a time of international uncertainty, the Alien and Sedition Acts proved to be a double-edged sword. While they were justified by the Federalists as necessary precautions against internal and external threats, their repressive nature sparked significant controversy and debate about the boundaries between national security and civil liberties. Over time, the acts were widely condemned as a violation of the fundamental rights enshrined in the Constitution. This backlash played a role in the eventual decline of the Federalist Party and underscored the enduring tension in American history between security and freedom, a balance that would continue to be debated in the decades to follow. Chapter 4: Jeffersonian Republicanism. Jeffersonian republicanism emerged as a robust ideological counterpoint to the Federalist vision, advocating for a government that was more responsive to the people and wary of centralized power. Jefferson and his followers believed that the strength of the nation lay in its adherence to the principles of individual liberty, agrarian values, and local self-governance. They envisioned a republic where the government's authority was strictly limited by the Constitution and where states retained significant independence, allowing for a closer connection between citizens and their political institutions. At the heart of this philosophy was the belief that power should remain as decentralized as possible. Jeffersonians argued that a strong central government posed a continual threat to personal freedoms and could potentially evolve into a tyranny. They saw the concentration of power not as a means to achieve stability, but as a risk that could undermine the very ideals of the American Revolution. By limiting federal authority, they hoped to ensure that ordinary citizens retained a strong voice in government. This perspective resonated deeply with many who lived in rural communities, where local governance was both a tradition and a practical reality. Economic policy under Jeffersonian republicanism also reflected a commitment to simplicity and self-sufficiency. Jefferson and his supporters favored an agrarian economy over the burgeoning industrial and commercial interests championed by the Federalists. They believed that the virtue of independence was best cultivated through farming, and that an agrarian way of life promoted both moral and economic well-being. While the Federalists pushed for sophisticated financial systems and urban development, the Jeffersonians envisioned a nation of independent farmers whose lives were intertwined with the land. This economic ideal was not merely a practical preference. It was also a moral stance against what many viewed as the corrupting influence of commerce and banking. In addition to their focus on limiting government power and promoting agrarian values, Jeffersonian Republicans also emphasized the importance of civic virtue and an informed citizenry. They believed that a healthy democracy depended on the active participation of individuals who understood their rights and responsibilities. Education was seen as a cornerstone of civic life, and many Jeffersonians supported efforts to establish public schools and promote literacy. Their hope was that an educated populace would serve as the best safeguard against the concentration of power and would be capable of scrutinizing government actions critically. While Jeffersonian republicanism provided a counterbalance to Federalist policies, it was not without its own complexities and contradictions. The emphasis on limited government, for instance, sometimes made it difficult for the Republic to act decisively in times of crisis. Moreover, the ideal of an agrarian republic conflicted with the rapid expansion of a market economy, as emerging commercial interests began to reshape American society. Despite these challenges, Jeffersonian ideas continued to influence political discourse by insisting on the primacy of individual rights and the dangers inherent in unchecked government power. Ultimately, Jeffersonian republicanism was more than a set of policy proposals. It was a comprehensive worldview that celebrated freedom, democracy, and a natural order rooted in the land and the individual spirit. Its legacy would come to shape not only the direction of American political institutions, but also the enduring belief in the right of citizens to govern themselves without undue interference from central authorities. The Revolution of 1800. The Revolution of 1800 marked a turning point in American politics, signifying not merely a change in leadership, but a profound transformation in the way the nation understood itself and its democratic processes. This election, which saw Thomas Jefferson and the Democratic Republicans come to power, was celebrated as a peaceful transfer of authority that underscored the resilience and maturity of the young republic. The change in power from the Federalists to the Jeffersonian Republicans was seen as a repudiation of the policies of the previous administration and a reaffirmation of the ideals of popular sovereignty. For many, the Revolution of 1800 was a vindication of the belief that government should be more responsive to the will of the people. The victory of Jefferson and his supporters was interpreted as a signal that the American electorate was prepared to recalibrate its emphasis toward individual liberties, local governance, and agrarian values. The Federalist era, with its focus on strong central authority and expansive economic policy, had become associated with elitism and an overreach that many believed compromised the Republican ethos. In contrast, Jefferson's vision, which championed a limited federal government and a more decentralized model, resonated deeply with citizens who valued the principles of independence and self-governance. At the heart of this political upheaval was the transformation of public discourse and party organization. The campaign leading up to the 1800 election was intense, with debates over the role of the federal government, foreign policy, and economic priorities taking center stage. The contrast between the two visions was stark. Federalists had pushed for an active government that intervened in the economy through mechanisms such as a national bank and tariffs designed to protect emerging industries, while the Democratic Republicans argued for a simpler, more rustic republic in which the government's role was minimized and individual freedoms were paramount. This division in political ideology not only redefined partisan alignments, but also set the stage for a political environment that would continue to see vigorous debates about the scope of governmental power. The Revolution of 1800 was also significant for its demonstration of the peaceful transition of power, which served as a powerful model for democratic governance worldwide. Unlike many other nations that experienced violent upheavals when regimes changed, the American transition was largely orderly. This smooth passage of authority reinforced the legitimacy of the electoral system and provided an early example of the resilience of constitutional democracy. It reassured citizens that political differences, even when profound, could be settled without descending into civil conflict, thereby strengthening the nation's long-term prospects for political stability. Furthermore, the revolution signified a shift in the national narrative. It was a period in which the interpretation of American identity evolved as the nation moved away from the revolutionary rhetoric of resistance to one that embraced governance through elected representatives. The election of 1800, therefore, was not merely a partisan victory, but a cultural milestone that redefined the relationship between the citizenry and its government. Through this event, the United States demonstrated its commitment to a democratic process that could adapt and reform itself in response to the changing aspirations of its people, setting a precedent for future political transformations. Dismantling the Federalist Agenda. The transition from Federalist to Jeffersonian Republican governance marked a decisive moment in which the new administration undertook sweeping measures to reverse policies that had defined the previous era. With the victory of the Democratic Republicans in the 1800 election, the Jeffersonian leadership immediately set out to curtail the Federalist agenda that they believed had centralized power and favored the elite at the expense of broader democratic principles. This process involved a series of legislative and administrative moves aimed at dismantling institutions and policies that, in the eyes of the new government, had undermined the spirit of republicanism. One of the central targets was the National Bank, a symbol of Federalist financial policy instituted by Alexander Hamilton. Jefferson and his supporters argued that the bank concentrated economic power in the hands of a few, subverting the vision of an agrarian republic based on decentralized, local decision-making. Through a combination of refusing to renew the bank's charter and diverting federal funds away from institutions it supported, the Jeffersonians sought to weaken a financial structure they deemed inconsistent with their ideals of economic equality and independence. This move was both symbolic and practical, representing a broader effort to decentralize the fiscal apparatus and ensure that government power was distributed more equitably among the states. In addition to financial reforms, the new administration worked systematically to reduce the influence of Federalist legal and administrative practices. Key appointments were made to replace Federalist officials with those sympathetic to Jeffersonian principles, ensuring that the judiciary and executive agencies could foster a governance style that emphasized limited federal power. By reshaping the bureaucratic landscape, the Democratic Republicans aimed to remove what they considered vestiges of elitism and paternalism that had marked the previous administration's approach to governance. The dismantling of the Federalist agenda also extended to foreign policy and trade. The Federalist emphasis on close ties with Great Britain and robust maritime policies was reoriented towards a more neutral and self-sufficient approach. This recalibration was designed not only to realign American interests on the international stage, but also to reduce the influence of commercial and financial elites who had benefited from policies that fostered strong economic links with Europe. By reducing the nation's entanglements abroad, the Jeffersonians believed that the United States could focus on internal development and safeguard its sovereignty. Culturally, the process of dismantling the old guard was accompanied by an effort to redefine American identity. Critics of the Federalists argued that their policies had created an aristocratic class whose interests were misaligned with those of ordinary citizens. In response, the Jeffersonian Project embraced a narrative of democratic renewal, highlighting the virtues of simplicity, individual empowerment, and local control. Such rhetoric resonated with large segments of the population, particularly in rural areas where the agrarian lifestyle was seen as the true embodiment of American values. Ultimately, the systematic reversal of Federalist policies during this period was more than a mere series of policy changes. It was a transformative shift in American political culture. By dismantling the Federalist agenda, the Jeffersonian Republicans reshaped the governing framework in a manner that emphasized decentralized power, individual liberty, and economic self-reliance. This reorientation would not only influence domestic policy for years to come, but also leave an indelible mark on the evolving nature of American democracy. The Louisiana Purchase. The Louisiana Purchase marked a pivotal moment in American history, dramatically expanding the nation's territory and altering its trajectory in terms of economic growth and geopolitical influence. In 1803, under President Thomas Jefferson, the United States acquired a vast tract of land from France, an event that not only doubled the size of the nation, but also set the stage for future expansion to the West. This transaction was driven by a mixture of diplomatic maneuvering, economic necessity, and a visionary interpretation of American destiny. At the time, France, led by Napoleon Bonaparte, was in the midst of several military and financial challenges. Napoleon's ambitions in Europe were continually at odds with the resources required to maintain control over distant colonial territories. The sale of Louisiana, therefore, represented an opportunity for France to recoup some losses while freeing itself from the burdens of governing an expansive and logistically challenging territory. For the United States, the purchase was seen as an invaluable opportunity to secure control over the Mississippi River and New Orleans, ensuring free access for American farmers and merchants to vital trade routes. The negotiation process for the Louisiana Purchase was not without its difficulties. Thomas Jefferson, A staunch advocate of limited government and a strict constructionist of the Constitution, faced a constitutional dilemma when it came to acquiring new territories. Despite his reservations about federal authority to expand executive power, Jefferson ultimately decided that the long-term benefits far outweighed the potential overreach. The deal, negotiated by American envoys Robert Livingston and James Monroe, not only secured approximately 828,000 square miles of land at a price of about $15 million, but also demonstrated the flexibility of American political thought. This expansion was justified on the grounds of national security and economic opportunity, even if it stretched the boundaries of constitutional interpretation. The implications of the Louisiana Purchase were profound. With the addition of the new territory, the United States dramatically increased its natural resources and potential for agricultural development. The fertile lands of the Midwest promised to transform the economic landscape by providing ample space for farming and settlement. As more settlers moved into these territories, new states would eventually join the Union, helping to shape the federal structure of the nation. The purchase also spurred a wave of exploration, most notably the Lewis and Clark expedition, which provided critical information about the geography, indigenous peoples, and natural resources of the vast expanse to the west. These explorations played a key role in integrating the new territories into the national economy and political life. Furthermore, the Louisiana Purchase had significant strategic consequences. The acquisition eliminated French presence from North America, reducing the likelihood of European interference in American affairs. This bolstered national security by ensuring that the Mississippi River and New Orleans remained under American control, which was essential for maintaining internal trade and a cohesive economic system. The purchase also set a precedent for future territorial expansion, reinforcing the idea that the United States was destined to grow and that its national character was intrinsically linked to the concept of manifest destiny. In summary, the Louisiana Purchase represented a defining moment of transformation for the United States. It not only doubled the nation's size, but also stimulated economic development, fostered exploration, and enhanced national security. The acquisition remains one of the most significant accomplishments of early American diplomacy and is celebrated for its enduring impact on the nation's growth and identity. Chapter 5: Expansion, Culture, and Society. As the United States evolved from a fledgling republic into an expanding nation, the interplay of territorial growth, cultural development, and social transformation became increasingly significant. The early decades of the republic witnessed a dramatic expansion westward, an event that not only redrew maps, but also reshaped the social fabric and cultural identity of the nation. This period of growth was marked by both opportunity and tension, as new lands promised prosperity while also challenging existing social structures and traditional ways of life. Expansion brought together communities from diverse backgrounds and fostered the gradual emergence of distinct regional identities. On the frontier, settlers encountered a rugged, untamed landscape that required resilience and innovation. The promise of fertile soils and abundant natural resources spurred waves of migration from established eastern settlements to the vast territories beyond the Appalachian Mountains. This movement not only increased the overall population, but also introduced a mix of languages, customs, and traditions. As communities took root, they established localized forms of governance and social institutions that were inherently linked to the unique challenges and opportunities of frontier life. At the same time, expansion influenced cultural perceptions and aspirations. The notion of manifest destiny, the idea that the United States was preordained to span the continent, became a powerful cultural force that motivated many to pursue new opportunities in the West. This belief reinforced the importance of individual enterprise and self-reliance, traits that were celebrated in literature, art, and political discourse. The evolving cultural narrative positioned the American frontier as a crucible for new ideas, where freedom and ingenuity could flourish away from the established hierarchies of old Europe. It also sparked debates about the balance between progress and preservation, as the drive for economic growth sometimes clashed with the desire to maintain traditional ways of life. Socially, the rapid westward expansion contributed to significant demographic changes that affected class, ethnicity, and gender dynamics. As new territories were settled, the social order that had characterized the eastern states was both reinforced and challenged. The influx of immigrants, combined with the movement of populations from rural and urban centers alike, resulted in a dynamic mix of cultural influences. This melting pot of traditions and practices enriched American society, but it also led to conflicts over resources, political power, and cultural norms. Debates over land rights, the treatment of indigenous peoples, and the role of slavery in the expanding territories intensified as the nation grew, laying the groundwork for future social and political conflicts. Cultural and social changes were also closely tied to technological innovations that accompanied expansion. Improvements in transportation, such as the development of canals and later railroads, helped knit together disparate regions and fostered greater economic interdependence. The flow of goods, ideas, and people across these expanding networks contributed to a growing sense of national identity. Local customs began to blend into a more homogenized American culture, even as regional distinctions persisted. Schools, churches, and civic organizations established by frontier communities played an essential role in transmitting cultural values and shaping the everyday lives of settlers. In essence, the era of expansion was not solely defined by its territorial gains, but by the complex interplay of culture and society that emerged alongside these changes. As the young nation stretched its borders, it also expanded the boundaries of its social and cultural identity, forging a multifaceted legacy that continues to influence American life. Westward migration and native displacement. The westward migration that characterized early American expansion was a transformative period that reshaped the nation's landscape, economy, and demography. As settlers surged into the vast territories beyond the established colonies, the promise of fertile land, abundant resources, and new opportunities drove an influx of pioneers. This movement, often celebrated as a pursuit of freedom and prosperity, was marked by profound consequences for Native American communities whose lives and territories were irrevocably altered in the process. Settlers traveling westward were drawn by the ideals of manifest destiny, a belief that the United States was fated to expand across the continent. This ideology provided both a moral justification for expansion and a rallying cry for those eager to establish a new life on the frontier. The call of open land fueled the dreams of individual success and the creation of new communities, leading to rapid settlement in previously sparsely populated areas. This expansion was facilitated by improvements in transportation and communication, which made it easier for settlers to traverse long distances and spread into territories that were once remote and inaccessible. However, the relentless march of settlers had devastating impacts on Native American populations. For centuries, indigenous peoples had developed complex societies, maintained sustainable relationships with the land, and established vibrant cultural traditions. The arrival of large numbers of settlers disrupted these long-standing practices, as Native communities were increasingly forced off ancestral lands to make way for farms, towns, and later, railroads and industrial ventures. The displacement was not solely a matter of relocation. It often involved the breaking of treaties, violent confrontations, and forced removals that left deep scars on indigenous communities. The loss of land had immediate practical consequences for Native Americans. Their economies, which were built on hunting, gathering, and farming in harmony with a delicate environmental balance, were undermined as the ecosystems they depended on were altered by new agricultural practices. The influx of settlers led to overhunting, deforestation, and the introduction of new diseases, which further weakened native populations already under pressure. Traditional ways of life were disrupted as communities were divided, and the social structures that had sustained indigenous cultures for generations were eroded by the imposition of foreign governance and economic systems. Amid these hardships, the displacement of Native Americans also sparked various forms of resistance. Many indigenous groups fought to defend their lands through legal challenges, negotiations, and in some instances, armed conflict. These struggles, however, were often met with overwhelming military force and legislative measures that favored settlers and the expanding federal government. The legacy of these conflicts is reflected in a long history of grievances and legal battles that continue to influence the relationship between Native American tribes and the United States today. The story of westward migration and the corresponding Native displacement is a complex narrative of ambition, conflict, and cultural loss. While the expansion of settler civilization contributed to the growth of a powerful nation, it also came at a significant cost to the indigenous populations who had inhabited the continent for millennia. The interactions between these two groups ultimately transformed the social and political landscape of America, leaving behind a legacy that is still felt in the ongoing struggles over land, rights, and cultural preservation. Religion, education, and reform. In the early decades of the American Republic, the interplay between religion, education, and reform constituted a vibrant force shaping the nation's cultural and social landscape. Amid rapid territorial expansion and the turbulence of political change, these three spheres influenced public life and helped forge a collective national identity rooted in moral values and community progress. This period witnessed a confluence of idealism and practical initiatives that encouraged both individual self-improvement and broader social change. Religion played a significant role in shaping early American society. Many settlers carried with them a deep sense of religious purpose, viewing their journey to the New World as a means of establishing a society based on a set of moral principles. The Great Awakening had left an indelible mark on the American psyche, fostering a spirit of revivalism and emphasizing personal piety and moral reform. As communities developed, religious congregations often functioned as the center of social life, offering both spiritual guidance and communal support. Churches were not only places of worship, but also served as meeting places where ideas about justice, charity, and social responsibility were disseminated. The influence of religious thought during this time contributed to the founding of various reform movements that aimed to ameliorate social ills and advocate for a more ethical society. Education emerged as a critical institution in this era of change, regarded as an essential component of both personal advancement and the development of a well-informed citizenry. Early American leaders recognized that in order to sustain a democratic government, citizens needed to be educated about their rights and responsibilities. As a result, efforts were made at both the local and state levels to establish schools and institutions of higher learning. The curriculum in these early schools was often steeped in classical studies and religious teachings, reflecting the belief that moral and intellectual development were intertwined. By promoting literacy and critical thinking, education provided the necessary tools for individuals to engage with political ideas and participate effectively in civic life. Moreover, the drive for public education was seen as a means of promoting social mobility and reducing disparities between different segments of society. Reform movements during this period addressed a wide range of issues, from temperance and abolitionism to improvements in mental health care and prison conditions. Many reformers were inspired by their religious convictions and the belief that society could be perfected through concerted effort and moral rigor. Driven by the conviction that individual efforts could lead to collective benefit, these initiatives sought to ameliorate the conditions of the impoverished, disenfranchised, and marginalized groups. Women, in particular, played a pivotal role in many reform movements, using their influence in religious communities to advocate for issues such as education, temperance, and suffrage. The call for reform was pervasive, permeating political debates and social policies, and eventually led to a series of legislative and grassroots efforts that aimed to address the challenges of a rapidly modernizing society. Ultimately, the dynamic interaction between religion, education, and reform in early America helped shape a national culture that valued progress, moral responsibility, and civic duty. This period established enduring legacies in the form of institutions, social practices, and legal precedents that continue to influence contemporary American life. The synthesis of spiritual belief, intellectual development, and pragmatic efforts at social improvement created a framework within which the United States could address its internal divisions and build a more inclusive and just society. The growth of American identity. Over the course of its early history, the United States embarked on a transformative journey in which a shared national identity began to emerge from a mosaic of diverse cultures, regional traditions, and conflicting political ideologies. From the colonial period to the early decades of independence, Americans sought ways to define themselves beyond the framework of their European origins, cultivating an identity that would be uniquely their own. This growth was marked by evolving ideals of liberty, democratic values, and an intrinsic belief in the potential for progress, which came to represent the very soul of the nation. In the Revolutionary Era, the American identity was forged as a reaction against the Old World Order. The struggle for independence brought together citizens from various backgrounds under the banner of freedom and self-determination. The shared experience of fighting against a common adversary fostered a sense of unity and purpose. This period of collective endeavor not only instilled pride and resilience, but also laid the groundwork for the ideals that would define American character in the years to come. The ideas of popular sovereignty and individual rights resonated deeply, shaping the national discourse and providing the foundation for the country's political and cultural evolution. As the new nation expanded its territory, the process of westward migration further contributed to the evolution of American identity. With each new wave of settlers venturing into uncharted lands, regional differences gradually blended with emerging national symbols. The ideal of manifest destiny, for example, became an enduring myth that encapsulated the belief that America was destined to expand its territory and influence. This expansive vision fostered a unique sense of exceptionalism, reinforcing the conviction that the United States was not only different from other nations, but also superior in its commitment to liberty and progress. As settlers encountered new challenges and opportunities, their struggles and triumphs helped shape a pragmatic, resilient identity that valued innovation and self-reliance. Cultural expressions during this formative era also played a critical role in unifying the citizens of the newly established nation. Literature, art, music, and public ceremonies emerged as means to celebrate the country's revolutionary heritage and its aspirations for the future. These expressions served to bridge differences between various regions and social classes, giving rise to a common narrative about the American experience. In the process, myths and legends about the nation's founding heroes grew into powerful symbols that encapsulated the spirit of determination and freedom, providing a touchstone for future generations. Over time, the growth of American identity became further solidified through the development of institutions such as public education, legal systems, and democratic governance. These institutions fostered civic participation and nurtured a collective sense of purpose by encouraging citizens to engage in public debates and work toward common goals. In this crucible of transformation, a new national consciousness emerged, one that celebrated diversity while nurturing a shared commitment to the principles of equality, liberty, and justice. Ultimately, the growth of American identity was a gradual, multifaceted process that not only defined the nation's early character, but also set the stage for the democratic ideals that continue to influence American society today. Chapter 6: Challenges at Home and Abroad. The early United States faced a multitude of challenges that tested the resilience of its political institutions and the unity of its people. At home, the nation grappled with issues of economic instability, social divisions, and territorial conflicts, while abroad it navigated the complex dynamics of international relations and rapidly shifting European alliances. Both spheres of challenge demanded pragmatic responses and tested the young republic's commitment to its founding principles. Domestically, economic difficulties were a constant source of tension as the government worked to establish policies that could stabilize the nation's finances and promote growth. The lingering debts from the Revolutionary War, combined with the uneven development of infrastructure and trade networks, placed immense pressure on the federal government to create a balanced fiscal system. Legislative debates raged over the proper role of government in regulating commerce, supporting industry, and managing interstate relations in a diverse and widely dispersed nation. Farmers in the rural hinterlands and merchants in emerging urban centers often found themselves at odds over policies that appeared to favor one group over another, highlighting the persistent challenge of reconciling disparate economic interests under a common national agenda. Social challenges further complicated the domestic landscape. Rapid westward expansion intensified regional disparities and the struggle for power among state governments, while also provoking disagreements over issues such as slavery and native displacement. As settlers moved into new territories, conflicts erupted over land claims and native rights, leading to enduring grievances and violent confrontations. The integration of diverse communities, including immigrants and indigenous peoples, proved difficult as the nation sought to establish a uniform legal and cultural system that could accommodate its pluralistic society. These tensions underscored the challenge of creating a cohesive national identity in a country that was as varied in its traditions as it was in its geography. On the international stage, the United States was similarly challenged by a world in flux. European powers were engaged in constant struggles for dominance that threatened to draw the young nation into conflicts far beyond its borders. The ideals of neutrality were repeatedly tested as American commerce and security came under strain from the naval policies of established European states. The need to secure favorable trade agreements, while resisting pressures to align with one European bloc or another, placed Washington and his successors in a precarious position. Diplomatic engagement had to be carefully balanced with domestic priorities, even as internal debates about foreign policy intensified. International conflicts, such as the ongoing hostilities between Britain and France, had a direct impact on American livelihoods, affecting everything from trade routes to the sense of national security. The federal government was forced to develop a diplomatic framework that could effectively manage these external pressures. It attempted to maintain a stance of cautious neutrality while also protecting its economic interests and territorial integrity. This careful maneuvering involved cultivating relationships with multiple European powers and actively asserting American rights as a sovereign nation. The challenges at home and abroad were interconnected, with domestic policy decisions often influenced by international circumstances and vice versa. In navigating these turbulent waters, early American leaders laid the groundwork for a pragmatic approach to governance that has continued to shape the nation's foreign and domestic policies to this day. Maritime tensions and trade restrictions. During the early decades of the American Republic, maritime tensions and trade restrictions emerged as critical challenges that had profound implications for the nation's economy and foreign relations. As American trade expanded, the young nation found itself increasingly entangled in the disputes of European powers, whose conflicts often spilled over into the realm of commerce. Navigating these troubled waters required a careful balancing of diplomatic nuance and assertive protection of national interests, a challenge that would define American foreign policy for years to come. At the heart of these tensions was the ongoing struggle between Britain and France, whose wars severely disrupted global trade. Both European powers imposed trade restrictions and seized neutral ships, forcing the United States to take a stand on issues of maritime rights. American merchant vessels were subject to unwarranted inspections, detentions, and even seizures, as the belligerents sought to undermine the economic viability of nations that refused to pick sides. For the United States, each incident was not merely an isolated episode of interference, but a signal of deeper conflicts that could directly impact the nation's ability to secure vital trade routes and export its products. The economic impact of these maritime disputes was substantial. American merchants and manufacturers depended heavily on international trade for revenue and growth. The imposition of trade restrictions, whether through British blockades or French decrees, created an environment of uncertainty that compromised the reliability of shipping and increased the risks associated with overseas commerce. In response, American leaders began advocating for policies that would assert the rights of neutral nations and safeguard commercial interests. The debates in Congress and in diplomatic circles soon turned toward questions of maritime law and the need for a coherent strategy to counter foreign encroachments on American shipping. In the midst of these struggles, the United States worked to establish itself as a sovereign nation with the right to conduct business on the high seas without undue interference. The administration of President Thomas Jefferson, in particular, was mindful of preserving the neutrality that allowed the nation to thrive economically while avoiding entanglement in European conflicts. Efforts to negotiate with foreign powers, coupled with measures to expand the nation's naval capabilities, were part of a broader strategy to protect American commerce and uphold the principle of neutral rights. Through these actions, the United States sought not only to secure immediate economic interests, but also to lay the groundwork for a long-term framework in international law that would respect the autonomy of nations in their maritime activities. In addressing maritime tensions and trade restrictions, American policymakers set a precedent for future engagement with a tumultuous international order. Their responses, forged in the crucible of early global conflict, would eventually evolve into a legacy of striving for balance, fairness, and national sovereignty on the world stage. Native resistance and the Western frontier. The expansion of the United States into the Western territories was marked by an ongoing struggle between the advance of settlers and the steadfast resistance of Native American nations. As pioneers moved into vast, unsettled lands, long-standing indigenous communities found themselves confronted by an unprecedented wave of encroachment that threatened both their lands and their way of life. This confrontation between expanding American frontiers and Native American resistance became a defining element of early U.S. history, setting the stage for conflicts and a long legacy of negotiation and strife. For centuries, Native American tribes had cultivated intricate relationships with the land, guided by traditions and cultural practices that had sustained them for generations. Their governance systems, social bonds, and spiritual beliefs were deeply intertwined with the natural world, shaping an identity that was both resilient and adaptive. However, the arrival of European settlers and the subsequent push westward disrupted these established ways of living. The promise of fertile lands and economic opportunity spurred relentless migration, forcing indigenous peoples into conflict as they sought to protect their ancestral territories. The resistance mounted by Native American groups was as diverse as it was persistent. Numerous tribes organized themselves to oppose the influx of settlers, using both diplomatic negotiations and, when necessary, armed conflict to challenge American expansion. Leadership among the tribes emerged in various forms, with some chiefs opting for direct military engagement, while others sought alliances with different groups or appealed to the federal government for recognition and protection of their rights. The result was a multifaceted struggle that combined battles on the frontier with legal and political efforts to contest treaties that were often imposed under duress. These confrontations led to significant and often tragic consequences for Native American communities. As settlers claimed territory and established new settlements, indigenous peoples were gradually displaced, their access to traditional resources diminished, and their cultural practices disrupted. The cumulative impact of forced relocations, broken treaties, and violent encounters sowed deep divisions and left a lasting imprint on the collective memory of Native nations. This struggle also highlighted the broader challenges inherent in the concept of manifest destiny, where the ideals of progress and expansion came at the expense of long-established communities. Despite the overwhelming push of American expansion, Native American resistance never fully ceased. The enduring spirit of these communities is reflected in ongoing legal battles, cultural revitalization efforts, and the persistent assertion of indigenous sovereignty. The conflict on the Western frontier thus encapsulates not only the dramatic shift in the balance of power during the nation's early years, but also the resilient determination of Native peoples to maintain their identity and rights in the face of relentless change. The road to war with Britain. In the years leading up to the War of 1812, tensions between the United States and Britain steadily escalated, fueled by a combination of maritime disputes, interference with American commerce, and lingering resentment from the Revolutionary War. The United States, still in its formative stage, found itself caught between emerging national ambitions and the disruptive influence of European power struggles. The seeds of conflict were sown in part by Britain's practice of impressment, where American sailors were forcibly conscripted into the British Navy. This violation of American sovereignty struck a nerve in a nation that was keen to assert its independence and uphold the rights of its citizens. Trade restrictions imposed by Britain further deepened the rift. British policies aimed at controlling neutral commerce disrupted American trade by seizing vessels and imposing blockades that hurt American merchants and the growing economy. These aggressive tactics were seen not merely as economic pressures, but as a direct challenge to the nation's ability to operate as an independent, sovereign state. American leaders, who had long preached the importance of neutrality and free trade, increasingly viewed Britain's interference as an intolerable infringement on their economic and national rights. Diplomatic efforts to resolve these disputes, however, proved largely ineffective. Negotiations often faltered as both sides clung to principles that had become deeply symbolic of their national identities. For the United States, every act of British interference reinforced the perception that the nation was being treated as a subordinate power rather than a partner in international affairs. This dynamic fostered an environment in which calls for a more assertive response grew louder, as American public opinion increasingly turned against the British for compromising their economic stability and national honor. Political factions within the United States became more polarized as the issue came to define the country's stance on the international stage. While some sought to avoid direct conflict with Britain, arguing for compromise and diplomatic resolution, others believed that force was necessary to secure American rights and assert national dignity. This internal debate was fueled by reports of British arrogance and the constant reminder of past grievances from the Revolutionary War. The combination of maritime violations, economic hardship, and national pride ultimately paved the way for a growing consensus that war might be the only acceptable path to restoring American honor. By the time relations reached their breaking point, a series of miscalculations and provocations on both sides had set the stage for an armed confrontation. The road to war with Britain was not the result of a single incident, but rather the culmination of years of tension, policy failures, and a fundamental clash of national interests. As the United States prepared for conflict, the inevitability of war became a stark reminder that the struggle for sovereignty and respect on the global stage was an ongoing challenge, one that would ultimately shape the future of the American Republic. Chapter 7: The War of 1812 and its Aftermath. The War of 1812 emerged as a defining conflict for the young republic, testing the resilience and resolve of the United States in the face of external aggression and internal division. Sparked by long-standing maritime disputes, trade restrictions, and the infringement of American sovereignty, the war was a culmination of tensions that had built up over years of British interference. American leaders, determined to protect national honor and economic independence, mobilized for a conflict that would shape the nation's future. During the war, American forces encountered both unexpected setbacks and remarkable instances of valor and determination. The conflict unfolded along multiple fronts, from the Great Lakes region to the eastern seaboard, as battles ebbed and flowed with no clear victor emerging in the early stages. Military engagements such as the defense of New Orleans, albeit occurring after the signing of the peace treaty, became emblematic of American perseverance and contributed to a burgeoning sense of national pride. Leaders like General Andrew Jackson, whose military successes captured the public's imagination, played key roles in galvanizing support for the war effort, even as the fight exposed weaknesses in the country's defenses and command structures. The War of 1812 was marked by a dual narrative. On one hand, the conflict underscored vulnerabilities in the young nation's infrastructure and military organization, reflecting the need for improved coordination and long-term investment in national defense. On the other hand, it ignited a spirit of patriotism that transcended previous partisan divisions, uniting diverse segments of the population in a shared commitment to the Republic. This newfound unity was significant in its role in helping to forge a collective American identity, one that could rally citizens around the idea of resilience in the face of external threats. The aftermath of the war brought mixed results that would leave an enduring impact on the nation. Although the conflict ended in a stalemate with the Treaty of Ghent, which largely restored borders to their pre-war conditions, many Americans perceived the war as a moral and political victory. The resurgence of national pride and the strengthened sense of unity allowed the United States to enter a period of rapid growth and westward expansion. The war also spurred improvements in military organization and infrastructure, as well as a reevaluation of diplomatic strategies that would influence future international engagements. In the years following the war, the experience of conflict served as a catalyst for domestic reform and ignited debates about the nation's long-term direction. The memory of the War of 1812 underscored the importance of maintaining an agile defense posture while also providing a sense of empowerment that propelled the United States toward a more assertive role on the global stage. Its legacy, reflective of both the sacrifices endured and the spirit of perseverance, remains a pivotal chapter in the ongoing story of American resilience and national identity. Causes and campaigns of the war. The War of 1812 was precipitated by a complex interplay of grievances and strategic considerations that had been brewing for years before conflict erupted. Central to its causes was the widespread anger over British maritime policies. American vessels laden with goods were routinely intercepted on the high seas, and many American sailors were forcibly recruited into the British Navy under the practice of impressment. This blatant encroachment on American sovereignty not only threatened the nation's economic interests, but also struck at the heart of its national pride. The resulting maritime tensions deeply divided public opinion and made the prospect of war increasingly acceptable, even necessary, for those who viewed these violations as intolerable infringements on American rights. Another significant factor that contributed to the outbreak of the war was the persistent interference in American trade. Both Britain and France, embroiled in their own conflicts, imposed trade restrictions on neutral nations, and American commerce found itself caught in the crossfire. These restrictions severely hampered the nation's ability to engage in free trade and disrupted the livelihoods of merchants and farmers alike. Economic discontent, therefore, became intertwined with patriotic fervor as citizens rallied behind the call to defend their economic independence from foreign oppression. Internally, political pressures also played a crucial role in steering the nation toward war. The growing influence of nationalist sentiment among American leaders and the populace at large created a political climate in which asserting American dignity became imperative. Critics of the prevailing policy of neutrality argued that the nation's failure to act decisively in the face of British aggression would be interpreted as weakness. This belief energized a faction of politicians who saw in war not only a measure to reclaim lost honor, but also an opportunity to expand American territory and secure strategic advantages along its frontiers. On the military front, early American campaigns reflected both the fervor and the challenges inherent in confronting a professional European power. Initial military engagements, often characterized by disorganized troop movements and inadequate logistical planning, underscored the difficulties faced by a nascent nation trying to mobilize a diverse, state-based military apparatus. Battles were fought across a variety of terrains, from the Great Lakes region to the coastal areas, testing American resolve and forcing a rapid reassessment of military strategy and organization. Despite setbacks and tactical defeats, isolated victories spurred nationalist pride and contributed to a gradual improvement in command and coordination among American forces. Thus, the causes of the war, maritime infringements, economic pressures, and a rising demand for national self-respect intersected with the realities of early military campaigns, propelling the United States into a conflict that would reshape its national identity and influence future policy. The War of 1812 stands as a testament to a nation learning to defend its rights against significant external challenges, even as its young military confronted formidable obstacles in the field. Nationalism and the burning of Washington. The events surrounding the burning of Washington in 1814 had a profound impact on American nationalism, intensifying patriotic feelings and stirring a renewed commitment to self-determination. As British forces advanced into the capital during the War of 1812, the dramatic scene of the nation's seat of government ablaze left a deep impression on both citizens and leaders. The destruction of key buildings, including the Capitol and the White House, was not only a military setback, but also a symbolic assault on American prestige, galvanizing public sentiment and uniting disparate factions under the banner of national resurgence. In the immediate aftermath of the attack, many Americans experienced a mix of shock, grief, and indignation. However, this crisis also served as a crucible in which a stronger sense of national identity was forged. The burning of Washington underscored that even the most sacred symbols of national governance were vulnerable to external aggression. Rather than leading to despair, these events fostered a collective resolve to overcome the humiliation and rebuild the nation's honor. The resilience demonstrated in the face of such a blatant act of destruction became a rallying point for American citizens, transforming a moment of crisis into an emblem of unity and courage. Political leaders and military commanders capitalized on the widespread sentiment generated by the event, using it as a call to arms that transcended regional and partisan differences. Speeches and public pronouncements at the time emphasized that the attack was not merely an isolated military incident, but an affront to the very principles of freedom and democracy. This rhetoric resonated deeply with a populace already frustrated by prior episodes of foreign interference and domestic disunity. The burning of the Capitol thus became a powerful catalyst for renewed nationalistic fervor, strengthening the resolve to defend the country's sovereignty against any future threat. As the war progressed, the memory of Washington's burning spurred efforts to enhance the nation's defense and to foster a more unified, prepared society. Military reforms, improved coordination among state and federal forces, and a re-energized public spirit all emerged from the lessons learned during this turbulent time. Moreover, the rebuilding of Washington itself became emblematic of the nation's capacity to recover from adversity. The collective determination to restore what had been lost further solidified American identity and underscored the importance of perseverance in the face of overwhelming challenges. Ultimately, the burning of Washington, while a moment of profound loss, served as a turning point that ignited a surge in American nationalism. It reminded the nation of both its vulnerabilities and its indomitable spirit, setting in motion a process of renewal and reconstruction that would define the character of the United States in the years to follow. The Treaty of Ghent and a New American Confidence. The Treaty of Ghent, signed in December 1814, marked a crucial turning point in the War of 1812 and paved the way for a rejuvenated sense of American confidence. The treaty effectively ended hostilities between the United States and Britain, restoring pre-war borders without addressing many of the maritime issues that had sparked the conflict. However, for many Americans, the terms of the treaty were less important than the fact that an agreement had been reached. The negotiation and signing of the treaty signaled an end to the uncertainty and disruption of years of war and began a process of national healing and renewal. American negotiators at Ghent faced the challenge of balancing British demands with the need to maintain American sovereignty and security. Although the treaty did not yield significant territorial gains or resolve long-standing trade disputes, it succeeded in terminating a war that had exposed vulnerabilities in the nation's defenses. The cessation of hostilities allowed the United States to focus on internal development, strengthening its military capabilities, and consolidating its rapidly expanding territory. The successful conclusion of negotiations demonstrated that the United States could assert itself on the international stage, even against the might of an established European power. The aftermath of the treaty fostered a new spirit of national confidence that reshaped American identity. The experience of enduring a protracted conflict and emerging with a peaceful resolution instilled a renewed optimism among citizens. This surge of national pride was symbolized by a series of celebrations and public commemorations that highlighted the resilience and determination of the American people. The war had served as a catalyst for a deeper understanding of the nation's strengths and potential, and the treaty became a testament to the ability of a nascent republic to negotiate on its own terms. Domestic reforms and military reorganization soon followed as policymakers and citizens alike sought to capitalize on the momentum generated by the cessation of war. The lessons learned during the conflict spurred investments in infrastructure, defense, and education, which collectively boosted the country's long-term prospects. The renewed sense of confidence permeated the political and social spheres, encouraging individuals to pursue new opportunities and contribute to the nation's growth. As the memory of the war receded, the Treaty of Ghent stood as a symbol not only of negotiated peace, but also of a reawakening American spirit. In essence, while the Treaty of Ghent may have restored the status quo ante bellum on paper, its legacy was far more profound. It provided the United States with a much-needed respite from external aggression and laid the groundwork for a period of cultural and economic growth. In the wake of the treaty, a new era of American confidence took root, one defined by the belief in national resilience, the ability to overcome challenges, and the promise of a bright future on the world stage. You've been listening to Empire of Liberty, A History of the Early United States Republic, 1789 to 1815, written by Harry Montgomery, narrated by Cedar Reyes.